Welcome. You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts, Sylvia and Sylvia Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us. You're listening to Latin Waves and your host, Sylvia Richardson. I'm delighted to be joined by Jorge Marti, the head of Venezuela Secretariat. Thank you for joining us, Jorge.
It's a pleasure to be with you, as always.
Now, there is so much to speak in a very new year. 2023 has barely started, but there's a lot that has gone on. So I'd like to offer this perhaps as a review of the year so far. And I wonder if we could start with the Bolsonarista movement that began in January.
This was some beginning of the year. It was a bit like a repetition of the Trump assault of the Capitol in the United States. And more or less the same thing happened in Brazil. The Bolsonaro supporters had been protesting since the end of November. They did not want to recognize the result of the elections, which had given the victory to Lula, the candidate of the Workers' Party. And they had done all sorts of things. They'd been camping outside the military barracks, demanding the intervention of the army. And the army was not very keen to intervene, but at the same time was not very keen to remove these people from outside the military barracks. And this all went into a crescendo. And at the beginning of January, a group of them, but it wasn't a very large number, but a group of them that were camping out in Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, and others that had arrived in coaches from different parts of the country, they decided to assault, to take over the three main buildings that are the site of the institutions of power in the capital, the Supreme Court, Presidential Palace, and the National Congress. The most scandalous thing is that the police, the military police, which is under the control of the regional governor of Brasilia, did not do anything to stop them. On the contrary, they seem to be escorting the Bolsonaro supporters as they were going to carry out the illegal invasion of official buildings. And there was clear complicity between the Minister of the Interior in the region of Brasilia, who is a Bolsonaro supporter. He is actually a former minister of the Bolsonaro government, and the Bolsonaro supporters who acted in a completely thuggish and hooligan way in assaulting the institutions of power. But however, this was a very weak movement. It was small in numbers. It did not have fundamental support of any wings of the armed forces. And in fact, everyone came out against this attempt very early on. And by the end of the day, the military police had now obeyed the orders from Lula, removed these people from the official buildings and arrested a few hundred of them. And that was the end of it. But this was then followed the day after, and even the same day in the evening, by big demonstrations, big anti-fascist, anti-Bolsonaro demonstrations in all the main cities, in Sao Paulo, in Rio, in Brasilia. And this is what the ruling class was really afraid of, the fact that this small action by a small number of Bolsonaro supporters could provoke a massive reaction on the part of the people. And that's why the movement was put down so quickly. I have to say also that there is a lot of hypocrisy on part of Joe Biden, the US president, who immediately came out to say that, we must respect democracy, and this move by Bolsonaro supporters is completely scandalous and we don't support it. When the same government, the government of Joe Biden, has supported a military coup, a civic military coup that has taken place in neighboring Peru on December the 7th. So it seems that the love for democracy is very is a clear case of double standards. In some cases they do, in some cases they don't. In fact, in Peru, the United States was behind the coup. And in Brasilia, the United States did not want this coup to go forward. They've had enough of Bolsonaro being in power, although they are responsible for Bolsonaro's rise to the presidency. But now that he's been removed, they think that perhaps Lula will be a safe pair of hands. And this is another interesting part of the story. The fact that Lula's government and coalition is composed of very different types of people. There's obviously the Workers' Party that Lula represents, but there is also the vice president, Alckmin, Geraldo Alckmin, who is an open bourgeois candidate who stood against the Workers' Party in previous presidential elections, was the governor of Rio de Janeiro, and he is an out-and-out capitalist. And so the ruling class now thinks that because of this coalition that is behind Lula and the composition of his new government, that he will be a safe pair of hands. Now, if Lula does that, which seems quite likely, then he will disappoint the people who voted for him, wanting a change from Bolsonaro. And if he doesn't do that, if he doesn't follow the diktats of the ruling class, which I think is the least likely perspective, then he will have to break with his own vice president. So that's basically the situation in Brazil. Everyone's in favor of democracy, as long as democracy represents the rule of capital in this particular case. When I say everyone, I mean the representatives of the ruling class, the main bourgeois newspapers, the Brazilian capitalists, and their masters in Washington.
And those who profiteer from war and disruption, right? Can we just talk a little bit about Peru, because very little has been heard in the news about the coup in Peru.
It's a complete scandal. This is a country which is one of the largest producer of a series of mineral resources, gold and others, including rare earths, lithium, and so on. And it's a country that's quite important from that point of view. And there was a coup in December, on the 7th of December. The democratically elected president Pedro Castillo was removed from power by a vote in Congress, a vote that didn't follow any of the normal procedures, broke all the rules of parliamentary protocol, and he was basically removed from power. Earlier on, he had attempted to close down Congress, which is part of his powers as a president. He said, Congress has not allowed me to rule according to the mandate I got from the people, so therefore I'm going to close down the Congress and call new elections. It's not that he was starting a dictatorship, as some people have said, but he was just saying the truth, that the Congress had blocked all his parliamentary initiatives. He is the democratically elected president, so he was closing down Congress and convening new elections within the space of 3 months. Using that as an excuse, then the real coup developed, a coup that had been organized by the U.S. Embassy. The vice president of Pedro Castillo, Dina Boluarte, took over, and the coup had the support of U.S. imperialism, but also of the mining multinationals. This is the crucial question. The mining multinationals did not like Pedro Castillo, did not want him elected, tried to prevent him from being elected in July 2021, and now they wanted him out. Why? Why is this? Pedro Castillo is a teacher, a rural teacher, who is also a trade unionist, and he was elected on the basis of his presidential slogan was, never again poor people in a rich country. And as I said before, Peru is a very rich country, extremely wealthy country, but the wealth of the country is controlled by 16 big economic families and groups and the mining multinationals. One of the things that Pedro Castillo had said is we're going to renegotiate the contracts with the multinationals so that they become more favorable for the Peruvian people, that we get more of a share of the natural wealth that's extracted from our land, which seems to me a very moderate and reasonable program. But then he said that if the mining multinationals do not agree to renegotiate the contracts, then we will consider expropriation, nationalization. At the end of the day, these resources belong to Peru. But then I think that Pedro Castillo made a number of mistakes when he came to power. He had a Congress where he didn't have a majority. He had the opposition of the bourgeois media, the bourgeois newspapers, and everyone was against him. So he felt a bit isolated and started making concessions to the ruling class. He removed his foreign affairs minister, who was seen as too radical by the media. He and the military. He removed his prime minister, Bellido, because he was under attack from the ruling class. But the problem is that none of these concessions pleased the ruling class and the mining multinationals. They wanted more. In fact, what they wanted is Pedro Castillo should be removed from power. And so he was removed on the 7th of December, in an action which cannot be described as anything else than a coup against the democratically elected president. But the thing is that this coup gave rise to a mass movement of the people. Workers, the peasants, the students came out on the streets in the thousands. They went on strike. They blockaded roads. And a big movement developed. And the new government of Dina Boluarte, with the support of the right wing, resorted to massive repression. And I have lost count now of how many people have been killed by the army. The army was used against the unarmed protesters. The police using rifles, assault rifles, and so on, firing on unarmed population. And I think that up until now, between 60 and 70 protesters have been killed. And there's forensic evidence that a big majority of them were killed by police and the army using fire weapons against the unarmed population. And so this is basically what's been happening in Peru. Now there's been a certain pause in the movement, if you want, because of the carnival celebrations, but the Aymara and the Quechua peasants and workers in the south, in Puno, for instance, they're mobilizing again towards the capital, and the aim is to remove this undemocratic government. What are they asking for? Asking for some basic things. The Pedro Castillo should be released from jail, where he has been put. That the Congress, which is extremely corrupt, illegitimate, and should be closed down. And the Dina Boluarte, who is the new so-called president, responsible for the killing of many people, about 60 people, should be removed from power. That she should resign. That's the basic demands that they are putting forward.
You know, it's interesting that in the 21st century, we're still using words as democracy and capitalism as if they could possibly ever coexist. Well, it seems that people want to cultivate peace. You know, the machine of war seems to be always going, right? And throughout Latin America, we've seen the aggression of the U.S. empire. How are we doing as a region, you know, in the shadow of U.S. invasions elsewhere, you know, as we notice the level of violence and the level of not just, you know, a commitment to endless war that they seem to be promoting, using NATO as their shield, you know, into this perpetual war with Russia?
Yes, I mean, they now claim that NATO is just a defensive alliance. But this is very far from the truth. This is completely cynical. NATO is the most powerful reactionary imperialist force on earth, and the United States and the rest of NATO countries spend massive amounts of money in perpetuating this war machine. And NATO has intervened in a whole number of countries where no NATO countries been involved or attacked, like in Afghanistan, when the NATO bombing of Serbia in the 1990s, the invasion of Afghanistan, which lasted until very recently. All of this is clear that the NATO is the long arm of U.S. imperialism. For 30 years now, they've been closing in on Russia, surrounding Russia from all sides. So when you think about the war in Ukraine, it'd be foolish to think that this is just a result of the madness of one man in the Kremlin that decided completely out of reason to invade a neighboring country. No, this is the result of years. Russia had been promised that NATO will not advance towards the east at the time of the reunification of Germany in 1989. But all these promises were broken. The United States imperialism organized regime change in a whole number of eastern countries, which were previously part of the Soviet Union, and Russia saw this as a threat to the national security. Now Russia is a capitalist country. Russia is not progressive, and Putin is a reactionary leader who attacks the rights of workers, attacks pension rights, and so on. So in that, he's not very different from our own rulers in the West. But when he says that he was provoked into this war, that NATO is a threat to Russia, he is not wrong. Just imagine, for instance, if the United States, what will be the response of the United States if, say, Canada and Mexico were going to join a military alliance with Russia, and Russian troops and missiles were going to be stationed in Mexico and Canada? What will be the response of the United States? They will say, "Oh, our national security is under threat." And we know that because that's exactly what happened in 1961, 62, when there was an attempt to install Soviet missiles in Cuba, and this almost led to a nuclear confrontation with the United States. They did not accept that at all. So I mean that's the way things go. Capitalism means war and destruction, because capitalism is not just based in one country, but it's based on imperialism, on the expoliation of resources from other countries, in the fight for the control of natural resources, areas of influence, markets for their products, and cheap labor, and so on. And this is basically what's behind this war in Ukraine. And quite rightly, the United States is not getting much support for the war aims or the war efforts from Latin American countries, or in fact for most of the countries around the world, in Africa, in Asia. There's not a lot of appetite for this war. And why is this? Because in these countries, the people have experience of what it means to be at the receiving end of U.S. imperialism, so they don't necessarily want to take sides in this question. But at the same time, this war is extremely costly. The United States is forcing, the United States itself, but also forcing Europe to send massive amounts of money, of weaponry, of ammunition, of and so on, to this war in Ukraine, to make sure that Russia cannot win, or rather the Ukraine doesn't lose the war, which it doesn't seem to be going exactly the way. But this money is money that could be used for health spending, for education, be used for many useful things that is now been thrown down the drain of war and destruction. And the more money is sent, the more this war is prolonged and creates further destruction. This is the nature of capitalism in its imperialist age, really.
But we know that we have now recovered from the depression of 2007, that, the debt just keeps blooming. The U.S. has over $31 trillion in debt right now. And while they're bolstering, funding pensions for Ukrainian soldiers fighting against Russia, the U.S. is collapsing internally. Their debts are out of, unsustainable. So can we talk about the profitability of violence? Because there are some winners in this war. We've seen massive trillions of dollars for those who manufacture weapons, but also the war in Iraq was not benign war. We were told they were liberating children and women and whatever, but at the end of the day, the war cost $13 trillion that the U.S. people paid. And the only ones who benefited were so-called the companies that were hired to rebuild that country after it was destroyed. And so let's talk about the face of imperialism and how this so-called rhetoric of democracy bringing not only undermines our efforts of someday having a democracy, where people are participants and also key catalysts of how we organize our social affairs.
Yes, I mean, a long time ago, at the time of the First World War, Lenin was asked, "Oh, but war is terrible," he was told by someone. He said, "Yeah, war is terrible. It's terribly profitable." And this is the truth. While people are being bombed and houses are being destroyed, infrastructure is being destroyed in Ukraine, there are people rubbing their hands, the arms manufacturers on both sides of this conflict, but particularly in the West. Now there is talk that NATO stockpiles of ammunition are running low because so much is being used in this war in Ukraine. And weapons companies turn around and say, yes, well, give us a contract and we'll build more, we'll ramp up production. And this is how war is also used to increase the profits of the arms manufacturers. As for democracy, well, I mean, there is very little left of democracy in Ukraine. As a matter of fact, the Communist Party was banned in 2014. A number of other parties have now been banned under spurious excuses. The mass media is controlled by the government. There's no critical voices allowed. And so basically there's not much left of democracy to defend in Ukraine, in the same way that there wasn't any democracy to defend in Afghanistan. And the result of the U.S. invasion has not been more democracy, but the opposite. And there's all these other examples of countries that had a democracy, where the United States didn't like the governments, and they just removed them through a military coup, through a military invasion, and so on. This is the democracy is just a fig leaf. For instance, yesterday, I think it was a couple of days ago, there was this vote at the United Nations, overwhelming vote against Russia in relation to Ukraine. And so now this is in the headlines of the newspapers, but they don't tell what they don't tell you is that the United Nations has voted for many years. I think it's now 20 or 25 years, every single year, an overwhelming resolution against the U.S. blockade of Cuba. And obviously Washington hasn't taken the slightest bit of notice, or the United Nations resolutions in relation to Israeli occupation of Palestine have also been ignored. In fact, whenever they talk about democracy, this is just a cover for the real naked interests of the big companies, the big multinationals, which are the ones who really rule the governments in their own private interests. This has nothing to do with democracy. Democracy is supposed to be the common ownership of the means of production, the democratic planning of the economy with the participation of everyone, so that the economy is run in the interest of the many and not the profits of the unelected privileged few. So what we have is really not democracy, but the dictatorship of capital.
With so much drumming of war in Canada, it seems like, being so close to the States, the government has decided the only option is more war. There is very little in our news media about peace, or even, speaking of peace seems to be an act of, disloyalty, and so it seems like we are in very surreal times. It's hard to imagine to be in a society where the only talk is more war, and nuclear war can be a cause to celebrate. So where do you find hope? Where do you find your inspiration when you see that there is a struggle, and we seem to be subsumed, by the empire machine of war making and perennial work at that, perennial war at that.
Yes.
It just.
There are many places where you can draw optimism from. Like, for instance, the movement in Peru. In Peru, the people have not resigned themselves to the fact that the president they elected has been removed by the multinationals. They've come out on the streets and risking their lives. 60 have been killed, but nevertheless, they're still on the streets. They have resilience. I don't know, 3 years ago, there was the big Black Lives Matter movement in the United States where millions of people, I think, according to one figure, 26 million people came out on the streets against racism, institutional racism, and police violence. This is quite amazing. The people want change. The people can't stand this anymore. But they're prepared to come out on the streets in the millions in some occasions. There's been huge movements across Latin America, for instance, for abortion rights, against violence on women in Argentina, in Mexico, in Chile. There's been huge uprisings in Chile, in Ecuador, in Colombia, and even the most reactionary governments have been removed. The people are prepared to fight if they are offered a clear way forward and a clear alternative. What sometimes happens is that the leadership of these struggles is not up to the task. What is the task? In my opinion, the task is not to change the system a little bit, to tinker with its worst aspects. Some people say we must fight against neoliberalism. And I say, yes, let's fight against neoliberalism. But neoliberalism is the only phase of capitalism in this particular epoch of crisis. So you need to pose the questions sharply and openly. What we need to fight is against capitalism, against imperialism, and replace it by a new system, a system of democratic participation and control over the economy and the political processes, a socialism. And this is the only fight that is worth fighting. And I think we should be optimistic for two reasons. One, because there's no other alternative. And number two, because we see all around us, there's a new generation of young people who've grown up in this period of crisis, of war, of imperialism, destruction of the climate, and they are rising up. They are at the forefront of all of these movements, movement against imperialism, the movement against the destruction of the planet, the movement for women's rights, against violence, against racism, against police racism, and so on. And this is really the future. This is the future. And these people, these young people, they deserve a leadership, an organization that is capable of bringing them to victory once and for all.
Thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you for all your work. How can people access your work?
Yes, thank you. It was a pleasure to be with you. The Hands of Venezuela campaign you can find on social media and on our website, handsofvenezuela.org. I'm also on the editorial board of In Defense of Marxism, Marxist website, which you can find on marxist.com.
Thank you again for being with us. Take care.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an independently produced syndicated radio program made available for free to campus and community radios, and also to the world at latinwavesmedia.com.